Dennis R. MacDonald shows in his work how the Gospel of Luke, the book of Acts, is fiction. It is imitating earlier material. Specifically in this episode, he's going to show you literary dependence on Euripides' Bacchae. We're talking 400, 500, almost 600 years before the book of Acts was even written, especially since many of the academics on my channel are willing to go and say, this is most likely early 2nd century, sometime 2nd century book. This is not early eyewitness, actual companion of Paul. That is what the literalist, fundamentalist Christians are typically peddling. And in this episode, you're going to see things from the prison break to the women in the wilderness, the singing that's going on with the Maenads. There's even direct quotes in the book of Acts from Euripides' Bacchae. Dennis has shown Homer's Iliad, the Odyssey, etc. Sign up for the course. I edited my life away on Dennis's course showing the Greek imitation, how the Gospels are using the older Greek sources in imitating it to model their narratives for their Jesus. The same goes on with the book of Acts, which is going to do the same thing for Paul and for Peter, and of course, Jesus. This is fiction, novel fiction, fan fiction. It's just not literal history. So let's get over it. Dr. MacDonald, always a pleasure to learn and hang out with you and pick our minds. Welcome back.
Oh, thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you for making the trip here. And for those who are viewers, people who get the books, you make this kind of stuff possible. So get ready for a deep conversation. I, for the longest time, thought that Acts was a literal narrative telling you what's really going on. But it doesn't take long after having a conversation with you to see there's some literary creativity taking place on behalf of the author and taking heroic figures like Paul and painting them with other heroic figures. And it's not just other humans like Socrates, but gods themselves like Dionysus. But Paul's even better than them. So I'm curious to see what you have to offer us, and let's dive into the material as you see fit.
Thank you, Derek, and thank you, those who are watching this. I hope you get as much pleasure out of these texts as I do. Derek and I are going to be reading from my book, Synopses of Epic, Tragedy, and the Gospels. And much of what we're going to read today is from volume 2 that's in this book. And it's called Mimetic Synkrisis, or Comparison of the Acts of the Apostles. And the comparison is going to be with characters from Greek literature, especially Homer, Euripides, and its rivalry with the Aeneid. But today we're also going to talk about imitations of Plato. This second volume of the book is organized in 4 parts. 1, Luke's Iliad, where we have extensive imitations of Homer's first epic. Then Luke's Odyssey, and we have some 40 episodes that are similar in between Luke, Acts, and the Odyssey. Then Luke's Bacchae, and then Luke's Plato or Socrates. Luke's Socrates. I need to introduce Euripides' Bacchae to you very briefly because most of you probably have not read it in the last week. Dionysus was born in Thebes, but his mother was scandalized by the people in Thebes because she boasted that she had conceived by Zeus, which she had, and people denied it, and they thought that she was covering up a sexual encounter with a mortal. Dionysus is going to go back disguised as a mortal priest of his cult to Thebes, and he brings with him the Maenads from Lydia, that is in Asia Minor, to Thebes, and they are going to be the chorus of this play. When he arrives in town, he punishes the town by driving the women into the hills to sacrifice and to worship him in madness. And in order to supply them food in the wilderness, he produces a magical wine and water for them. Now, the king Pentheus of Thebes is so upset by this that he wants to round up these women and punish them. And especially he wants to get rid of this Dionysian priest and kill him. And of course, it's Dionysus himself in disguise. There's a prison break of the Maenads, the women in who have been captured in the wild. But there's also a prison break of Dionysus himself after an encounter. There are two books in the New Testament that extensively imitate Euripides' Bacchae. These are not historical stories. They are mythological stories that are applied to Jesus or to Paul in more positive ways. So the Acts of the Gospel of John, I call a Dionysian gospel because Jesus' first miracle is turning water into wine. He offers water to the Maenads who are out in the wild. But Paul also, actually, the Acts of the Apostles was written before the Gospel of John. Most people don't know that. And the author of the Gospel of John probably knows the Acts of the Apostles. And he, instead of having Paul being the Dionysian character, it's Jesus himself who's the Dionysian character. But I'm going to read the prison break of Dionysus in the Bacchae, and Derek is going to help me with the reading, especially of the biblical text, and we're going to compare them. Now, the fascinating piece for me is that this occurs at the end of chapter 16 in the Acts of the Apostles, and the very next chapter has Paul in Athens playing the role of Socrates. So in the first story, we find Paul as the beneficiary of mythological madness. In the very next story, he's an exemplar of philosophical sophistication. So you have both madness and philosophy. And Friedrich Nietzsche was famous for talking about the Dionysian and the Apollonian, that is the philosophical. And Paul embodies both the beneficiary of divine intervention, but also the wisdom of a philosopher. It's really a fascinating juxtaposition. So we're reading from page 447 in what I call Luke's Bacchae, number 11, more prison breaks. Pentheus, that is the king of Thebes, scandalized by the barbaric practices of the Maenads, imprisoned the god who's disguised as a priest. I hear of a new evil in the city. Our women abandon their homes in fake Bacchic ecstasy, scurry about in the wooded hills, and honor and dances some new demon, Dionysus, whoever he is. Those whom I have seized with their hands bound, my servants hold safely in the public jail. But though still on the loose, I will hunt from the hills. By securing them in iron nets, I will soon put a stop to this pernicious Bacchic activity. They say that some stranger has come, a beguiling wizard from the land of Lydia. Pentheus later succeeds in arresting the wizard and locked him up. Compare this with the following episode in Acts that Derek will read.
When her masters saw that their hope for gain had vanished, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the agora before the rulers. Once they presented them before the magistrates, they said, "These people are disturbing our city. They are Jews, and are promoting customs that are inappropriate for those of us who are Romans to accept or perform."
Pentheus similarly objects that the worship of the Maenads was difficult for Greeks to accept. Already like fire, the insolence of the Bacchants is near, a huge failing in the eyes of Greeks. We must not delay. We will go to war with the Bacchants. Now, Derek's going to go back to Acts.
The crowd added their objections, and the magistrates tore off their clothes and commanded them to be flogged. They laid many blows on them and tossed them into a prison, with orders to the jailer to hold them securely. Having received such instructions, he threw them into the innermost part of the prison and secured their feet in stocks.
Before I forget it, I want to talk about a little of the backstory in the Acts of the Apostles. When Paul gets to Macedonia for the first time, he encounters a woman named Lydia. She's worshiping in the wild with other women, only women. Her name, and she's a merchant of purple garments. Purple is, of course, the color that is sacred to Dionysus because he's the god of wine. And the name Lydia, she's from Thyatira, which is in Lydia. So it's Lydia from Lydia. The chorus in the Bacchae are the Lydian women. They're the women that came from Lydia, and it's only women that are in the chorus.
Just a tease. So there's a name match, and there's also a clothing match. And the idea is pretty common. I mean, purple. Who hasn't bought grapes before, right? Like, grapes come out. Not saying there aren't green grapes, but typically you see like a red purplish wine, and that was probably commonplace. Anywho.
Well, and you have a geographical reference too. These women come from Lydia. They're called the Lydian women. And Lydia is Lydia from Lydia. Lydia from Lydia. So this is a flag that Luke is giving to his readers that Paul is going to be a new Dionysus.
And real quick, just to tease, I'm glad you're commenting on this. And for those who are watching and enjoying the trip, we would not know this. We weren't raised to know the Bacchae. We aren't raised to know the stories of Odysseus, the Odyssey, the Iliad. And that's the sad part. I wish we were, but because of that, this doesn't jump out at us. And I imagine the New Testament scholars, it's the same problem. But continue, Dennis.
As Euripides tells the story, outside Dionysus's prison, the chorus of Lydian women sang for their master's release. From within the prison, the god sang his ritual chants to his Maenads and shook Pentheus's palace. Later, his song produced an earthquake. "Shake the surface of the ground, O Lady Earthquake," he shouts out. After his escape, he tells the chorus, Bacchus came and shook the house. One reads this in Acts, Derek, at midnight.
At midnight, Paul and Silas were singing psalms and praying to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly there was a great earthquake, such that the foundations of the prison were shaken. The doors immediately flew open, and the restraints all fell off.
So this is what Dionysus then says in the Bacchae. Thinking that I had fled, the king grabbed his dark sword and entered the building. The weapon, though, did no harm because the god had morphed into a phantom. The king, quote, dropped his sword in exhaustion, for though he was a man, he dared to go to war with a god. Similarly in Acts, Derek.
The prison guard woke and saw the doors of the prison wide open. So he drew his sword, intending to commit suicide, because he presumed that the prisoners had escaped. Paul shouted with a loud voice, "Don't hurt yourself! We are all here!"
Similarly, Dionysus told Pentheus, "We will wait for you. We will not flee." The same word that is used in Acts. Both Euripides and Luke emphasize the darkness of the prison. In the play, Pentheus's burning palace provides illumination. So Derek and I are going to read these parallels. Light came from Pentheus's burning palace. Barbarian women, dumbfounded by fear, have you fallen to the ground? It would appear that you observed Bacchus shaking the house of Pentheus.
Having asked for a light, the jailer burst inside in a panic, fell before Paul and Silas, brought them out and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?"
Raise your bodies and take courage, O women, and dispel fear from your flesh.
They said, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you and your house will be saved."
So Pentheus fights his fight with God, and the Philippian jailer converts. Quite a contrast. So Derek, pick it up there. They were speaking.
They were speaking the word of the Lord to him and to everyone in his house. At the same hour of the night, he took them in and washed their wounds. He himself and all those of his household were baptized at once. He brought them to his house, set a table, and rejoiced with everyone in his house, because he had believed in God.
Luke's emphasis on the joy of the jailer's household contrasts with the agony of Pentheus's mother Agave and grandfather Cadmus, another Synkrisis. Unfortunately, the ending of Euripides' play has not survived intact. In what does, Dionysus appears deus ex machina, that is from the machinery of the Skene, rebukes the Thebes for its disbelief and predicts punishments for Cadmus and Agave. That is, Agave is Dionysus's mother, Cadmus is his grandfather. Pentheus' mother, grandfather. Cadmus asks for mercy, admitting, "We have acted unjustly." This is what we find in Acts, Derek.
At daybreak, the magistrates sent the lictors and told them, "Release those men." The jailer told these words to Paul. "The magistrates sent to have you released. So now leave and go in peace." But Paul said to them, "They beat us in public without a trial, even though we are Roman citizens, and threw us into prison. But now they are throwing us out of the sly? Certainly not. Let them come and escort us out themselves." The lictors reported these words to the magistrates, who feared when they heard that they were Romans. So they came, called for them, escorted them out, and asked them to leave the city.
The masters of the prophesying slave girl had pressed charges through avarice. Paul and Silas thus appealed to Roman law for protection from rogue local officials. The reader would rightly deduce that although Christians occasionally suffered injustice from hostile Roman authorities, they could expect justice from the empire as a whole. Furthermore, Paul and Silas demonstrate that one can be both a Christian and a law-abiding Roman citizen. Derek and I are going to read these remarkable parallels, and I need to give credit to the history of scholarship in my field. Many scholars have seen these parallels. And in fact, when Paul talks about his own conversion, he says he has a heavenly voice. "It is hard for you to kick against the goads." That is quoted in the Acts of the Apostles. That's a quotation from the Bacchae,
Right.
Where Dionysus in disguise tells Pentheus, "It is hard to kick against the goads. You should not fight, a mortal should not fight against a deity." And the words that are used there are the same words that are used in Acts for fighting a god, the theomachia. So these parallels have been recognized by others, although I expand them, and I think I have a somewhat better translation. So here we go, Derek. Dionysus arrived in Thebes with a female entourage from Lydia, Asia Minor, intent on establishing his cult, that is, his worship, in Achaia. The Lydian women comprised the chorus.
Paul arrived in Philippi with an entourage from Troas, Asia Minor, intent on establishing the cult of Christ in Macedonia. Philippi, was his first European destination.
The god drove Theban women into the hills to worship.
The apostle converted Lydia, who was praying outside the city with other women.
Maenads possessed the gift of prophecy and hailed the new god. In Aeschylus, in the Eumenides, the Pytho, that is the female goddess, invokes Zeus Most High.
A possessed Pythian prophesying slave girl identified Paul and Silas as slaves of the Most High God.
Dionysus struck women mad.
Paul drove the demon out of her, a synkrisis.
Pentheus accused the god of introducing religious practices alien to Greeks and locked him in a dark prison without trial. He thought that he chained his feet, but actually he changed those of a bull.
The owners of the slave girl accused Paul and Silas of introducing religious practices alien to Romans. Then the authorities locked them up without trial and chained their feet in stocks in a dark prison.
Dionysus sang in his prison and caused an earthquake that freed them.
Paul and Silas sang praises in prison until the earthquake freed them.
Thinking Dionysus might escape, Pentheus drew his sword to slay him.
Thinking the prisoners had escaped, the jailer drew his sword to slay himself.
Instead of fleeing, Dionysus waited for Pentheus to emerge from the prison and tried to talk sense into him.
Instead of fleeing, Paul, Silas, and the other prisoners waited in the prison, and Paul talked the jailer out of suicide.
Light came from a burning palace. The Maenads fell to the ground in fear of the earthquake and fire.
The jailer asked for light, was terrified, and fell at the feet of Paul and Silas.
Pentheus dropped his sword when he failed to inflict harm.
The jailer sheathed his sword when he learned that no prisoner had fled.
Because Pentheus remained silent, his mother and sisters killed him. Later, his family grieved.
After the jailer converted, Paul baptized him with his household. They rejoiced.
Now, some of these parallels are weaker than others. I grant you that. And so you could get rid of, 5 or 6 of the parallels because they may seem forced to you. You cannot deny that there is a literary connection between these because of the vocabulary, because of the Greek words that are used. And Derek and I did not read the Greek just for purposes of this broadcast. But Derek, what do you think?
I think there's some common tropes. As I told you yesterday, while I may not know Greek, I can see patterns, themes, things like that jump out at me. Obviously, the singing, the gel, like how common is it? This is a question, right, of statistics. Who cares if you could read the language for a moment? How common are jailbreaks with earthquakes from singing? I mean, it's a serious question.
Yeah, right.
How common do Lydias from Lydia, dressed in purple and literally sound and act like a Maenad, with other women, how common are these kinds of things? And if they're not that common, then it should at least be considered. Hold on, what's going on? And looked at. And so I definitely think that this is something that I've seen come up a lot, and we both recognize there are differences here. In fact, synkrisis, as you point out in the parallels, jump out too, right? You're like, hold on, this guy wanted to kill the Dionysus guy. And in this narrative, he wanted to kill himself because in this painted narrative, well, he's going to get killed or something. He's disappointed because now he didn't do his job and made sure these prisoners stayed in prison. So they just a little bit of narrative tweaks to fit the context. And that shows you the sophistication on the author's part, that he's able to change the narrative enough to fit his context of what he's saying. That's why I was saying in our course, sneak peek to those who haven't got our course that they need to get, and this book, when we're talking about stuff like the sailors and the boats and Jesus with many ships sail across the Sea of Galilee, these are, to me, the author didn't change enough And those are telltale signs for me to go, we know where this is a hint to help us connect us to the Odyssey or whatever. So Luke Acts seems to be a little better at making sure that he's retweaking the narrative, but the theme's there. It's undeniable.
Well, I don't think even in Mark, the business about other boats is carelessness. I think it's an intentional flag to the reader. This is comparative mythology. And so, but I want to do a little trick with you right now. Mimesis criticism has 7 criteria. And we've applied this in the course to Homer, but now I'm going to apply it to the Bacchae. So let's keep the microphone equidistant between us, and we'll be loud. And this is going to be mostly a question and answer. I'll give a question, and you just give a simple answer, but you could expand it if you want to. Was the Bacchae available in the world of Luke Acts?
Yes.
Definitely. Not just as a text, but also as a performance. Was it imitated widely?
Yes. And there were lots of plays happening all over the place.
And we know that it was imitated by Jews, by Christians, by pagans, and there's no doubt about that. So it's in the air, and it's a story of religion and religious persecution. So it's a perfect target for Jews and Christians. So there's no doubt about that. Now, were the parallels that we looked at dense and sequential and distinctive?
Yes, I would say yes.
Oh, amazing. And so much so that many scholars have seen these connections, especially in Acts. You have a quotation from the Bacchae, hard for you to kick against the goats. Now, why might an author, this is the interpretability criterion, why might an author want to rewrite the story of the Bacchae to portray Jesus as a Dionysus?
Well, I mean, this is my answer. If you're going to change people, if your target audience is a mission to a world where their medium is the Bacchae, the best way to do it is to turn their story against themselves. So if I'm going to infiltrate somewhere in China and I want to convince people in China and they have a certain thing called, I don't know, some specific thing, okay, I'm going to adopt that thing and then flip it if I want to get them on my side. You use the medium people are aware of and using. This is why you don't find Paul come in and out of nowhere use some Indian terminology. He's not dealing with Indians. He's dealing with people in the Greco-Roman world. So it's more of a practical thing. You turn what the people know so that they're familiar with it.
Okay, and the way it gets turned is, in the end, Pentheus is going to get killed. The jailer in Philippi is saved, he and his whole family. So Paul is more compassionate in his prison escape than Dionysus is. So that's a major synkrisis. Now, have other people in antiquity recognized these parallels? I think the author of the Gospel of John must have, because Jesus himself is playing a Dionysian role, and Pilate plays the role of Pentheus to some extent, and so does the Sanhedrin. So I don't know how we are doing on time. We're going to now move from chapter 16 of the Acts of the Apostles to the very next chapter, where Paul is no longer representing the god of madness and wine and frivolity and all that. Now it's going to be a philosopher.
So we went from madness and now we're going to sanity, but you're going to have to stay tuned to the next episode for that one.
And it was astonishing what I saw. Jesus sails the sea with a crew, that is, his disciples, that are not nearly as noble as he is, like Odysseus. Like Odysseus, Jesus keeps his identity a secret so his enemies can't kill him. The Jewish authorities play the role of Penelope's suitors. They love the best seats in synagogues, and they're willing to kill in order to win the inheritance. Judas plays the role of Melanthius, Jesus' turncoat slave. Jesus has his feet anointed by a woman, like Odysseus having his feet anointed by his nurse Euryclea, and she recognizes him from his scar. And the name Euryclea means renowned far and wide. And it's said of this woman who anoints Jesus that wherever the gospel is proclaimed, it'll be in her memory. So these parallels were so striking that I dared not give a new lecture on it because it hadn't been digested. And so I spent another summer working through the Gospel of Mark, creating criteria that where I might be able to make a claim that there's a literary connection. And at point after point after point, it became clear that Mark was imitating not just the Odyssey, but also the Iliad and also some tragedian plays. And I translated Homer and Euripides and Plato for myself in order to compare the Greek of the Gospel of Mark with the Greek of these stories. And it was unbelievable what I was finding. I also turned to a study of Greek rhetoric and understood better how literary imitation or mimesis worked. And it was that people were taught how to write by imitating recognized models and to compare heroes in an activity called synkrisis. Synkrisis is simply a comparison to show that one character is similar but better than another. And of course, that's what's going on in Mark. Jesus is like Odysseus, but he's better than Odysseus. He's like Hector in his death, but he comes back to life. So that's a synkrisis, and it goes on and on.